Eliana Reed stepped off the shuttle onto the vibrant soil of Xanthera, her boots crunching faintly against the iridescent blue sand. The planet's twin suns hung low on the horizon, bathing everything in a warm, golden glow. It wasn't exactly what she'd expected. Less gleaming skyscrapers and more sprawling gardens, where architecture blended seamlessly with the alien environment. Buildings rose like natural extensions of the land, their surfaces shimmering faintly, as though alive. "Eliana, over here," a voice called out. She turned to see a tall man with neatly trimmed black hair waving at her. His uniform bore the emblem of the Interstellar Research Exchange. "You must be Dr. Reed. I'm Dr. Adrian Sinclair. We'll be working together." Eliana shook his hand. "Pleasure to meet you. They told me you'd be my partner on this project." "So, you've been here for a while." "Nearly 6 months. Long enough to get used to the food, at least," Adrian said with a smirk. "Come on. I'll show you around the medical center." The path to the facility wound through what looked like a botanical garden, but every plant glowed faintly in the twilight. Some pulsed with a gentle rhythm, while others swayed as if stirred by a breeze that wasn't there. Adrian gestured toward a massive vine that spiraled around a crystalline tower. "That's the main research hub. The Xantherians grow their infrastructure. Organic tech is their specialty. Every building, every piece of equipment, even the data networks are bio-integrated. You'll see what I mean once we're inside." Eliana studied the vine. "It's like nothing I've ever seen. On Earth, we're still wrapping our heads around nanotech and cybernetics. It's a whole other level." "That's what we're here for?" Adrian said, opening a transparent door that seamlessly melded with the building's surface. "And here's where the real magic happens." Inside, the air was cooler, carrying a faint, earthy aroma. Rows of medical pods lined the walls, each one pulsating faintly. Alien and human staff moved between the pods, checking readings on translucent tablets. In the center of the room stood a tall figure with shimmering golden skin. Her elongated limbs and graceful movements marked her as Xantherian. "That's Mirathil, the head healer," Adrian whispered. "She's one of the best, though her bedside manner can be a bit aloof." Mirathil turned, her gaze locking onto Eliana. Her violet eyes were intense, as if she could see straight through the newcomer. "You are the Earth scientist," she said in perfect English, though her voice carried a lilting musical quality. "Welcome. I trust you will find our methods educational." Eliana nodded. "I'm sure I will. Thank you for having me." Adrian cleared his throat. "Mirathil, Eliana, and I will be reviewing your current treatment protocols. We'd also like to observe a few procedures, if that's all right." Mirathil's head tilted slightly. "You may observe, but I expect you to contribute. We do not need passive witnesses here." Eliana's lips quirked into a half-smile. "I wouldn't have come all this way just to watch." The Xantherian gave a faint nod and turned back to her patient, leaving Adrian and Eliana to explore the rest of the facility. "Well," Adrian said once they were out of earshot, "she didn't throw you out. That's a good start." Eliana laughed. "I'll take that as a win. So, what's on the agenda?" "We'll start by familiarizing you with their biotechnological approach. I know you're more used to traditional methods, but trust me, once you see how they integrate with their environment, it's hard to go back to the old ways." Eliana followed him into a laboratory where glowing vines coiled along the walls, linking the various instruments and monitors. Adrian picked up a device that resembled a crystalline stethoscope and handed it to her. "This is their diagnostic scanner. It's not just a tool. It's actually alive in a sense. It adapts to the patient's unique physiology." Eliana turned it over in her hands. "Amazing. Feels warm." "Yep. It syncs with your own bioelectric field. Give it a try." She held the scanner over her arm. A soft glow spread across her skin, and a series of images appeared on a nearby display. Bone structure, muscle composition, even a detailed analysis of her cellular activity. "Unbelievable," she murmured. "This could revolutionize Earth medicine." "Let's hope so," Adrian said. "But don't forget, we're here to learn from them as much as they're here to learn from us. If we do this right, We'll both come away better for it. Eliana nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and nervous energy. This was why she had agreed to the program in the first place, to push the boundaries of what she knew, to be part of something bigger. And with Adrian at her side, she felt a little more confident about the journey ahead. Chapter 2. The Xantherian Plague. The central medical chamber hummed softly as Mirathil guided a levitating diagnostic sphere over her latest patient. She worked with meticulous precision, yet a frown lingered on her normally calm expression. The patient, a fellow Xantherian whose luminous skin now looked dull, stirred weakly on the organic treatment table. Data flickered across semi-transparent panels around her, but none of it was promising. Mirathil, what's the current status on this strain? Adrian asked as he and Eliana approached. He stood a little back from Mirathil, respecting her space but clearly eager for answers. Worsening? Mirathil replied, her voice tinged with concern. This affliction spreads quickly through our neural pathways. Standard remedies are ineffective. Eliana peered at the data. So it's targeting your nervous system? But the readings don't show traditional pathogens. It's almost like a neural disruption at the cellular level, Mirathil finished. We have never encountered anything like it. Adrian stepped closer, folding his arms. Have you tried a two-step approach? Focus on stabilizing the neural signals first, then treating the physical symptoms. Mirathil's head tilted slightly, her violet eyes narrowing. Our methods typically address issues holistically. Isolating the neural activity from the body's systems may destabilize the patient further. Eliana chimed in. Maybe not if we use something to regulate the neural activity temporarily. On Earth, we've used implants, small devices that adjust neural firing rates during complex surgeries. Could we replicate something like that here? Mirathil hesitated, her gaze drifting to the floating diagnostic sphere. You believe a human implant could stabilize a Xantherian nervous system? Not directly, Adrian said, but the principle could work. Instead of a permanent implant, maybe a bioadaptive device. Something your tech is already good at, temporary, organic, but capable of adjusting neural signals until we find the root cause. Mirathil considered this, her golden skin catching the ambient light. A bioadaptive stabilizer. It is a concept I have not explored. Adrian grinned. There's a first time for everything. And you've got the perfect facilities for rapid prototyping. She nodded slowly. If we proceed, it must be carefully controlled. The risk of causing further harm is high. Agreed, Eliana said. But if we don't try, the infection will keep spreading. Your people have already lost. She hesitated, but Mirathil nodded for her to continue. You've lost too many already. Mirathil turned to Adrian. You said you have experience with such devices? Some, he admitted. I've worked on a few Earth-based projects. Eliana's the real expert in neural interface research, though. That's overstating it, Eliana said, shaking her head. But I've seen enough to know we might have a shot at stabilizing the patients. Very well, Mirathil said. You may assist me, but understand this is not a human laboratory. Our processes are unique. Adrian smiled faintly. We're not here to change how you work, just to help find a solution. Mirathil glanced between them, then turned back to the patient. Let us begin. The hours stretched on as the three of them worked together in the biolab. Adrian and Eliana quickly adapted to using Xantherian tools, which seemed almost alive in their hands. The diagnostic sphere hovered near their test equipment, providing constant feedback. Adjust the modulation slightly, Adrian said as he monitored the display. The signal's too strong. Might cause a feedback loop. Got it, Eliana replied, her fingers gliding over a bioluminescent console. What do you think, Mirathil? Mirathil studied the data, her brow furrowing in concentration. The neural signals are stabilizing, but not completely. We may need to integrate a secondary wave pattern. Adrian raised an eyebrow. Secondary wave pattern? Never thought of that. Eliana looked intrigued. That could work, if we can synchronize it. Precisely, Mirathil said. If the initial wave creates stability, the second wave could maintain it. I will make the adjustments. As Mirathil worked, Adrian stepped back and leaned against a smooth, vine-covered wall. She's good, he murmured to Eliana. Better than good, Eliana replied. She's brilliant, Adrian nodded. We might actually pull this off. By the end of the session, they had a prototype device. It was small, bioadaptive, and designed to tune itself to the patient's neural patterns. Mirathil held it carefully, examining their handiwork. It is unusual, but if it functions as intended, it may give us time to find a true cure. Adrian crossed his arms, smiling slightly. No pressure, right? Mirathil's lips curved in a faint smile of her own. Pressure often leads to innovation, does it not? True enough, Eliana said. Let's see if this works. They prepared the device for a controlled test on the patient. As the faint hum of the stabilizer filled the room, the three of them watched the monitors closely. The patient's neural activity began to even out, and their breathing grew stronger. It's working, Eliana whispered. Mirathil nodded, her expression one of cautious optimism. A small step forward, but there is much more to do. Adrian clapped his hands together. It's a start, though, and sometimes that's all you need. Chapter 3. An Unlikely Partnership. The atmosphere in the lab was tense, but not with fear, with anticipation. Adrian and Mirathil stood side by side, their hands busy with instruments that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Across from them, Eliana adjusted a set of translucent monitors, checking and double-checking the bioadaptive stabilizer's output. Adrian glanced at Mirathil. If this works, we should see some improvement in neural coherence within the first few minutes. If not, Mirathil's violet eyes flickered toward him. We will adjust as necessary. Eliana chimed in from her station. And by adjust, she means she'll tell you what to tweak, Adrian. Adrian chuckled. Fair enough. I'll take orders if it means saving lives. Mirathil tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. It is not a matter of giving orders, but of collaborating toward a solution. Exactly, Adrian said. But you know what you're doing, and we're just catching up. Eliana spoke up again. Don't sell us short, Adrian. We brought a lot to the table with that stabilizer idea. Mirathil, you were skeptical at first, right? Mirathil hesitated before nodding. It was a concept I had not considered, but it has shown promise. Adrian stepped back from the patient, wiping his hands on a cloth that felt more like soft moss than fabric. All right, the stabilizer is fully calibrated. Let's see what happens. They watched as the device pulsed softly, a faint blue glow radiating from the patient's neural pathways. The monitors showed a gradual shift. Erratic signals began to align, their rhythm evening out. The patient's breathing, shallow moments before, grew steady. Eliana leaned over the display. It's holding. We've got stabilization. Mirathil placed a hand on the table beside the patient. It is a start. The device functions, but we have not yet addressed the underlying cause. Adrian shrugged. One step at a time. We needed stabilization before we could even think about the root cause. Now that the patient's condition is stable, we can actually dig deeper. Mirathil turned to him, her expression unreadable. You have a straightforward approach. It works, Adrian said. No need to overcomplicate things. One problem at a time. Eliana nodded. And it's not like we're stopping here. We'll keep pushing. Mirathil's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer. A practical perspective. Perhaps we complement each other more than I first believed. Adrian smirked. Was that a compliment? It was an observation, she replied, though a hint of a smile curved her lips. Their focus returned to the patient as the device continued to hum softly. The room fell quiet, save for the gentle pulse of the stabilizer. After a few more minutes, Mirathil spoke again. The patient's readings remain consistent. We should begin preparations for the next stage of treatment. Eliana looked over at Adrian. Are you ready to dive back into the research? Always, Adrian said. But I think Mirathil should lead this next part. She knows the biotechnological side better than anyone. Mirathil inclined her head. You both have insights I lack. Together we will proceed. Adrian met her gaze. Sounds good to me. What's next on the list? She moved to another console, her movements fluid and deliberate. We must identify the source of the neural disruption. Without understanding its origin, any solution is temporary. Eliana joined her at the console. All right, let's dig into the initial cases. When did you first see these symptoms? Approximately 1 local cycle ago, Mirathil said. The first patients were isolated individuals who traveled through a particular region. At first, we believed it to be an environmental reaction. Adrian folded his arms, listening intently. But it wasn't. No, Mirathil confirmed. The symptoms spread to others who had never visited that region. Eliana frowned. So it's not strictly environmental. Could it be something in the supply chain? Food, water? Mirathil shook her head. All such vectors have been investigated. Nothing unusual was detected. Adrian rubbed his chin. What about personal interfaces? Any kind of tech everyone uses? That, too, was examined, Mirathil said. Our interface systems have remained unchanged for centuries. Eliana drummed her fingers on the console. If it's not environment, not the food, not the tech, what does that leave? Perhaps something entirely new, Mirathil said quietly. A factor we have not yet considered. Adrian leaned forward. Then that's where we start. We think outside the box. What's the one thing everyone has in common that no one's looked at yet? Mirathil's gaze shifted to the patient. You have a point. I will revisit the data with that perspective. Eliana nodded. And Adrian and I can look into the timing of the first cases. If we can find a pattern, something that links them, it might give us a direction. Mirathil glanced between them, then gave a single nod. Very well. Let us see what we can uncover. Chapter 4. Learning from each other. The lab was alive with activity as Adrian, Mirathil, and Eliana pored over the data from the latest tests. The bioadaptive stabilizer was holding steady, and the patient's condition had improved significantly. For the first time in weeks, the team had enough breathing room to shift their attention from crisis response to understanding the deeper cause of the illness. Adrian leaned against the edge of a glowing console, his arms crossed. All right, let's go over it one more time. We've ruled out environmental factors, food, water, and tech interfaces. What's left? Mirathil's long fingers moved deftly across the bioluminescent controls. What is left are variables we have not yet recognized. Perhaps there is an interaction between known elements we have not considered. Eliana nodded thoughtfully. Or maybe it's something we're not seeing because we're too close to it. On Earth, we sometimes bring in fresh eyes, another perspective, to catch things we might miss. Adrian gestured toward Eliana. You've been here the least amount of time. Any fresh perspectives? Crazy ideas we haven't tried yet? Eliana frowned at the console. Well, on Earth, we sometimes study wildlife patterns to track disease. What about the local fauna? Could an animal species be a carrier? Mirathil tilted her head. Our ecosystem is carefully monitored. However, it is not impossible that a previously unknown organism is involved. Adrian pointed at Mirathil. There's our next step. Let's start mapping the spread of the illness against known wildlife migration patterns. If there's an overlap, we'll have a lead. Mirathil nodded. I will provide the environmental data. You may compare it with the cases we have documented. As they worked, Adrian glanced at Mirathil's smooth, gold-toned features. She was entirely focused, her expression calm but intense. Do you ever take a break? He asked lightly. Mirathil's hands paused over the controls. A break? You know, time to relax. Clear your head. She glanced at him, one delicate brow arching. You are suggesting that I cease working while an illness threatens my people? Not exactly, Adrian said. Just that sometimes stepping away for a moment helps you come back with a clearer mind. Mirathil's lips curved slightly. I see. Humans have a unique approach to productivity. Eliana looked over her shoulder. You mean we're lazy? Mirathil's smile grew faintly wider. I would not call it laziness, rather a curious efficiency. Adrian chuckled. We'll take that as a compliment. The trio continued analyzing data well into the night. At one point, Adrian set aside his console and stretched. Okay, Mirathil, tell me something. You've been working here for decades, right? Mirathil nodded. Correct. And in all that time, you've never dealt with anything like this illness? No, she said, her tone thoughtful. We have encountered challenges before, but not of this nature. Our knowledge has always been sufficient. Adrian leaned against the console, his expression serious. So how does it feel, having to rely on outsiders, on humans, this time? Mirathil met his gaze steadily. It is unfamiliar, but you have contributed valuable ideas. The stabilizer, for example, is not something we would have considered. Eliana leaned back in her chair. I guess that's the whole point of the exchange program. We bring what we know, you share what you know, and together we figure out something neither of us could have done alone. Mirathil inclined her head. A reasonable explanation. It is not an easy adjustment, but it is necessary. Adrian smiled. You're adapting pretty well, if you ask me. The conversation fell silent as the group focused again on the data. Adrian's earlier comment about fresh perspectives lingered in the air. Mirathil, while reserved, seemed more willing to entertain new ideas than when they'd first met her. And Adrian's easygoing demeanor was clearly helping to bridge the cultural gap. As the hours passed, they began to see patterns emerge. Migratory routes of a particular flying species coincided with several initial outbreaks. The creatures resembling large, luminescent dragon. Adjusting the projection. If these creatures are carrying something from plant to plant, it might explain why the illness seemed to appear out of nowhere. Mirathil examined the projection closely. This is a lead worth pursuing. Adrian, can you assist with gathering more data on these creatures? Absolutely, Adrian said. If it means getting closer to the cause, I'm all in. Mirathil gave him a small nod. Then let us begin preparations immediately. Chapter 5, A Breakthrough. Adrian adjusted his headset and leaned over the console, staring intently at the data streaming across the bioluminescent interface. All right, let's run that sequence one more time, he said, nodding toward Mirathil. We need to confirm if these creatures are actually carrying the compound. Mirathil glanced up from the organic terminal she was operating. I am initiating the scan now. If the secondary readings match the previous pattern, we may have a direct link. Eliana entered the lab, balancing 2 steaming mugs in her hands. You two have been at this for hours. I thought you might need a pick-me-up. Adrian reached for one of the mugs. You're a lifesaver, El. Thanks. Mirathil observed the mug briefly before accepting it. A human beverage? Coffee, Eliana said with a grin. One of Earth's finest discoveries. Adrian took a sip and sighed. She's not wrong. This stuff powers half of humanity. Mirathil's violet eyes studied the dark liquid. It is bitter. An acquired taste, Eliana said. But it does wonders when you need to keep going. Adrian placed his mug down and returned to the console. Okay, we're picking up the compounds on the wings and proboscises of those dragonfly creatures. If they're transferring it to the plants, then to your people, that could explain why this spread so fast. Mirathil nodded slowly. But why would these creatures suddenly become carriers of a harmful substance? We must determine what caused the initial alteration in their behavior. Eliana chimed in. Maybe their environment changed. Some kind of disruption that forced them to interact with those plants differently. Mirathil tilted her head. Perhaps. The region where the outbreak began was untouched for many cycles. If a change occurred, it may have gone unnoticed. Adrian leaned back. Let's not waste time speculating. Mirathil, can we send a team out to that region, scan the area, and gather samples? We need to know if there's something in the environment that triggered this. Agreed, Mirathil said. I will arrange for a field unit to begin immediate surveys. Eliana grinned. You're really warming up to our proactive methods, Mirathil. Mirathil's lips curved into the faintest smile. Your methods, though unusual, have produced results. It would be imprudent to dismiss them. Adrian smirked. We'll take that as a compliment. The trio continued to analyze the data, working in tandem. Eliana cross-referenced environmental reports, while Adrian refined the bioscanner parameters. Mirathil coordinated with the field team, ensuring the equipment they needed was sent to the region. As the hours passed, their combined efforts began to reveal a clearer picture. The initial outbreak site was indeed near a water source that showed signs of contamination. This contamination appeared to have altered the composition of certain plants, which in turn affected the dragonfly creatures that fed on them. So it's a chain reaction, Eliana said. Something tainted the water, which altered the plants, which turned the dragonflies into carriers. Adrian nodded. But what's the source of the contamination? Natural or artificial? Mirathil studied the latest scans. The field team is reporting no known pollutants. It may be an unknown element or a natural shift we have yet to identify. Eliana leaned forward. What about subterranean activity? Could a shift in underground deposits have released something into the water? Mirathil's fingers danced across the console as she pulled up geological data. There have been no recent seismic events, but there are areas that remain unexplored. It is possible a new fissure has opened. Adrian sighed. Looks like we'll need to dig deeper, literally. If we can pinpoint the source of this contamination, we can figure out how to stop it from spreading. Mirathil nodded. I will prioritize an analysis of subterranean scans. If we can locate the origin, we can begin containment procedures. Eliana smiled. And once we contain it, we can figure out how to reverse the effects on the plants and the creatures. Adrian patted the console lightly. One step at a time. But this is the first real breakthrough we've had. It's a start. Mirathil's gaze lingered on Adrian for a moment. Your methods, while unconventional, have been effective. This collaboration has shown me new perspectives. Adrian shrugged. It's just a matter of combining what we know. Your tech, our out-of-the-box thinking, it works. Eliana raised her mug. To finding answers, even if we're still a few steps away from the finish line. Mirathil glanced at her mug, then back at Adrian. To finding answers. Chapter 6. The Cure. The lab was quiet except for the soft hum of the equipment. Adrian stood by the central console, reading over the latest reports. Mirathil was close by, her fingers moving deftly across the organic terminal as she sifted through new geological scans. Eliana was in the corner, consulting with the field team via a floating communication sphere. They had spent days following the contamination trail, and now, for the first time, all the pieces seemed to be falling into place. Mirathil, what's the latest from the environmental analysis? Adrian asked, keeping his eyes on the screen. She straightened slightly, turning to him. There is indeed a new fissure in the southern region, as we suspected. It appears to be releasing trace elements into the nearby water table. The plants that absorbed this water have undergone molecular changes, producing a compound that affects neural systems. Adrian nodded. And once the dragonfly-like creatures feed on those plants, they carry the compound to other areas. Correct, Mirathil said. This has created a chain of contamination that spread much faster than we anticipated. Eliana joined them, crossing her arms. Okay, so we've identified the source and the method of spread. What's next? Mirathil's violet eyes flicked between Adrian and Eliana. The contaminated water must be purified. If we can neutralize the compound at the source, the plants will return to their natural state, and the creatures will no longer be carriers. Adrian leaned against the console. What kind of purification are we talking about? Can your technology handle it? Mirathil hesitated. Our methods are effective, but this is a new situation. The compound's molecular structure is unlike anything we have encountered. We may need an alternative approach. Eliana raised a hand. Back on Earth, we've used certain bioengineered enzymes to break down harmful compounds in water supplies. Could we try something similar here? Mirathil considered the suggestion. A tailored enzyme might work, but creating one for an alien compound would be a complex process. Adrian straightened up. So let's not start from scratch. Mirathil, you've got centuries of biological knowledge. Could we use a native organism, something already adapted to the environment, to help break down the compound? Mirathil's eyes narrowed in thought. There are microorganisms in our waters that purify naturally over time. If we can enhance their properties. Eliana nodded. You mean, if we could accelerate their activity, we might be able to purify the water before the compound spreads further. Precisely, Mirathil said. We would need to identify the correct microorganism and increase its metabolic rate in a controlled environment. Then we could introduce it to the affected areas. Adrian smiled. That sounds like a plan. What do we need to get started? Mirathil turned back to the terminal, her hands moving rapidly across the controls. I will isolate the most promising microorganism. Eliana, you can assist me in analyzing its genetic sequence. Adrian, you can coordinate with the field team to prepare the deployment sites. Adrian gave a mock salute. On it. Eliana chuckled. We're getting good at this teamwork thing. Hours passed as the team worked tirelessly. Mirathil identified a microorganism with promising natural filtration properties, while Eliana helped design a method to enhance its metabolic rate. Adrian kept in touch with the field teams, ensuring they were ready to implement the solution as soon as it was ready. By the next day, they had a prototype process. Mirathil held a small, glowing vial in her hand, the enhanced microorganisms swirling inside. This should be sufficient for the initial tests. If it is successful, we can scale it up quickly. Adrian took the vial carefully. Let's hope it works. Mirathil nodded. We will know soon. The team traveled to the southern region, where the fisher's water flowed into the surrounding ecosystem. The area was eerily quiet, the normally vibrant plant life subdued. Adrian stood at the edge of the stream, watching as Mirathil prepared the first dose. We'll start with a small concentration, she said, pouring the microorganisms into the water. It will take time for them to adapt and begin breaking down the compound. Adrian crouched by the water, watching as the solution spread. How long before we see results? Hours, perhaps, Mirathil replied. If this works, the plants downstream should begin returning to their natural state. Eliana joined them, scanning the water with a handheld biomonitor. I'm already seeing a reduction in the compound levels. It's subtle, but it's there. Adrian grinned. Looks like it's working. Mirathil's expression remained cautious. Let us wait before drawing conclusions. We must be certain. The trio spent the day monitoring the site, and by evening the changes were undeniable. The once tainted plants had regained their natural glow, and the dragonfly creatures, no longer feeding on contaminated sources, began to disperse. Adrian turned to Mirathil. You did it. We did it, she corrected, glancing between him and Eliana. This was a joint effort. Eliana gave a tired but satisfied smile. And it's only the beginning. Now that we know the solution works, we can implement it across the affected regions. Adrian reached out, briefly touching Mirathil's arm. Nice work. She looked at him, her expression softening. You as well, Adrian. Your perspective has been invaluable. Chapter 7, Closer Than Ever. The initial success with the microorganisms had provided some breathing room, but the work was far from over. Adrian and Mirathil spent long hours at the central facility, tweaking their approach, monitoring the recovery of affected regions, and ensuring the remaining contaminated areas were addressed. Though the work was still demanding, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a sense of growing connection that neither of them openly acknowledged, but both felt. Late one evening, Adrian leaned against the counter of the lab's modest break area, sipping from a cup of something that Mirathil had insisted was not tea, but tasted close enough. I've been meaning to ask, he said, looking over at her as she meticulously cleaned a set of instruments. What brought you to this line of work in the first place? You don't strike me as the type who just falls into a career. Mirathil glanced up, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Healing has always been a respected path in my culture. As a child, I was drawn to it. There was something fulfilling in helping others regain their balance. Adrian nodded, his own smile softening. That's not so different from Earth. I think most doctors and researchers get into it for the same reason. It's not about fame or money. It's about making a difference. Mirathil set the instrument down carefully. And what of you, Adrian? What brought you to this path? He chuckled, running a hand through his hair. Well, my parents were teachers. They always told me that knowledge wasn't worth much if you didn't use it to help people. I guess I just followed that logic. Medicine research, it seemed like the most direct way to put what I learned to good use. Mirathil studied him for a moment, her violet eyes thoughtful. Your motivations are admirable. Not much different from yours, Adrian pointed out. We're both in this to help people. She nodded. That is true. Perhaps that is why we work well together. He tilted his head, intrigued by her choice of words. Do you think we work well together? Mirathil's lips curved into the faintest smile. We have accomplished much in a short time. It would be unreasonable to say otherwise. Adrian chuckled. Well, I'll take that as a compliment. Their conversation was interrupted by Eliana poking her head into the break area. Hey, lovebirds. I hate to break up the moment, but we've got new data coming in. The last treatment site is showing better than expected recovery. Mirathil straightened. That is excellent news. I will review the data immediately. Adrian glanced at Mirathil, a playful glint in his eye. Guess we'd better get back to it. Duty calls. As they returned to their stations, the dynamic between them felt subtly changed. Mirathil seemed more willing to engage in casual conversation, and Adrian found himself making small jokes just to see her react. Despite the intensity of their work, there was a warmth growing between them, an understanding that went beyond their professional relationship. One night, after the facility had gone quiet and the only sound was the soft hum of the monitoring equipment, Adrian and Mirathil found themselves alone in the observation chamber. They had just confirmed that the microorganisms were stabilizing another region's water supply, and for the first time in weeks, they allowed themselves to relax, if only for a moment. Adrian leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. We're getting close, he said. Feels like we might actually see the light at the end of this tunnel. Mirathil remained quiet, her gaze focused on the holographic map that displayed the recovery progress. After a moment, she turned to him. Your contributions have been vital to this success. I am grateful. Adrian looked over at her, his expression softening. It's a team effort, Mirathil. I wouldn't have gotten this far without you. She studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. Still, your perspective, your willingness to approach problems differently has taught me much. He smiled. I could say the same about you. Your patience, your attention to detail. It's helped me see things I would have missed. For a few moments, they simply sat there, the quiet hum of the room wrapping around them. Then, in a move that surprised even himself, Adrian reached out and lightly placed his hand over hers. Mirathil, I think we make a pretty good team. She looked down at their hands, then back up at him. There was no resistance, no hesitation, only a calm acceptance. We do. And just like that, the growing connection between them took one small but significant step forward. Chapter 8. A New Beginning. Adrian walked through the gardens surrounding the main facility, his boots brushing against the soft, glowing vines that wound through the pathways. The environment had changed drastically over the past weeks. Where once the plants had been sickly and dull, now they shone with a healthy luminescence, the air filled with the faint scent of blossoms that only opened under Xanthira's twin suns. Mirathil was waiting near the central fountain, her figure elegant and composed as always. When Adrian approached, she turned to him, her expression soft. The latest reports indicate full recovery in all the regions we treated, she said. The contamination is no longer spreading, and the native ecosystems are stabilizing. Adrian smiled, feeling a mixture of relief and pride. We actually pulled it off. Took a lot of late nights, but we got there. Mirathil tilted her head slightly. It was a joint effort. Your methods, while unconventional, proved effective. He smirked. You're really coming around on my methods, aren't you? Her lips curved into a faint smile. They have their merit. Eliana appeared behind them, carrying a set of data tablets. Good news keeps coming in. We just got the final set of readings from the field team. They're planning to scale up our microorganism treatment for ongoing maintenance. Looks like we won't have to worry about this happening again anytime soon. Adrian turned to Mirathil. So what happens now? You've got this place back in order. Do you keep working here? Or do you take some time off? Mirathil glanced around the garden, her gaze contemplative. There will always be new challenges. Our work is never truly finished. Eliana set the tablets down on a nearby bench. You've got a point, but you deserve a break too. Maybe even explore some non-work-related activities. Mirathil's brow lifted slightly. Non-work-related activities? Yeah, Adrian said. You know, like relaxing, enjoying the gardens, maybe trying some earth music or food. Things that aren't about solving crises. Mirathil's expression softened. An interesting concept. Perhaps I will consider it. Eliana grinned. That's a step in the right direction. As the three of them lingered in the garden, the suns began to dip toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the grounds. The plants seemed to glow brighter in response, their colors deepening in the twilight. Adrian turned to Mirathil. It's been a wild ride, hasn't it? She met his gaze, her violet eyes steady. It has. And yet, I believe our efforts have strengthened the bonds between our peoples. Eliana's comm device buzzed, and she glanced at it before stepping away. I'll give you two a moment. Got to check in with the field team. Adrian and Mirathil stood in comfortable silence for a time. Finally, Adrian spoke, his tone thoughtful. I came here thinking I'd just be helping out, lending a hand where it was needed. I didn't expect to learn so much from you. Mirathil inclined her head. And I did not expect to be so challenged by your unconventional approach. You have shown me new ways of thinking. He smiled, his voice softening. It's been an honor working with you, Mirathil. The feeling is mutual, she said quietly. Her hand brushed against his for a moment before she stepped closer. Adrian, what do you intend to do now? He considered the question, his gaze drifting across the glowing garden. I'm not sure yet. There's always work waiting back home. But part of me feels like there's more to do here. More to learn. She hesitated for a moment. If you choose to remain, there are still opportunities for collaboration. There is always more to discover. Adrian turned to her fully. I'd like that. If you think there's a place for me here, I'd like to stay. Mirathil's expression softened. You have already proven yourself invaluable. I would welcome your continued presence. As the last rays of sunlight faded, the garden seemed to grow even more vibrant under the twin moons. Adrian looked at Mirathil, a faint smile on his lips. Looks like we've still got a lot of work to do then. She nodded.